probably wondering how I got into African art, since I am really a Renaissance specialist. When I was in graduate school, I took some classes in African art, and I was also a teaching assistant for our big survey classes of African art. And the first time I was assigned to teach African art, I was petrified because I just didn't feel qualified to do it. But I really fell in love with the subject, and then I kept volunteering to be a teaching assistant for it. And it's really informed my own research because it's helped me to look at art in a different perspective and not to really see it just as art, but to see it in a more functional way, to see it as a part of ritual. And that's really how I approached my dissertation on domestic devotional art. But today what I'd like to do is to show you some examples of African objects that we have in the collection at Augustana. Some of these came to us recently from a generous collection donation given to us by Don Lucas, and a few things we've had acquired along the way. So I want to sort of give you a little bit of an overview of African art by looking at some of the objects we have in our collection. I'll show you some other examples in slide format. But I also want to talk about this concept of African art, because it's a really tricky term. It's really not an appropriate term, actually. When I teach African art classes, I start by having students read an essay by Kwame Anthony Appiah. And it's an essay that introduces an exhibition catalog of an exhibition on African art that took place at the Royal Academy of Arts in London about 15 or so years ago. And the title of the essay is Why Africa, Why Art? And so we start with those two questions because they really don't make any sense if you think about it. First of all, Africa is a continent. And it's comprised of over 50 different nations, and those nations are really arbitrary. I mean, they were devised by Europeans who came in and colonized the continent. And so what we're really talking about are hundreds of different ethnic groups. So Africa, this big general blanket term, is really not accurate in describing what we see. And the term art really isn't appropriate because some of these cultures, they don't even have a word for art. So what they've made are objects that are functional objects. They're connected to religion, they're connected to initiation rituals, they're connected to ways in which it basically teaching the village or the society about good and improper behavior. And so they're connected, they represent spirits. So they serve a particular function. Sometimes they're used, these African objects, we'll look more closely at textiles, to construct and create power in a king or a chief. So they're not meant to be images that hang on a wall. They're really not art. A lot of our conceptions about African art actually came through Western artists working in the early part of the 20th century, perhaps the most famous being Pablo Picasso. This is his Les Demoiselles d'Avignon from 1907. And he painted this partly in reaction to seeing works of African objects at the Ethnographic Museum in Paris. So European countries were bringing back African objects and basically just sort of taking them from these cultures. No idea who made them. Well, we maybe knew a culture, but no artist name attached to them. So these objects are brought back and put into ethnographic museums, as were people too. They were put on display. Actual Africans as a sort of oddity to be looked at by Europeans. But Pablo Picasso, he was inspired by some of the maps that he saw. He actually talks about being very sort of disturbed by things that he saw. And what he takes is the formal qualities, right? These abstract qualities, sort of reducing the idea of a face to basic geometric shapes, the sort of essence of a face. And not, what he liked about this is that it wasn't imitative of reality, right? Because until the later part of the 19th century, the goal of artists in the West was to be imitative, right? You wanted to, in your art, to imitate as best you can reality or what you see. Even if you're telling a mythological story or a biblical story, the style was still somewhat naturalistic. In African artists, I mean, this is a bit of a generalization, but much African art is rather abstract, as we're going to see here. And Picasso really admired that. He liked that about African art, and that's what he's taking to and bringing into this painting that's considered to be one of the great masterpieces of the 20th century, really transforming 20th century art here in the West and introducing this idea of abstraction. But he saw this as this kind of, what African artists were doing is this sort of like instinctual thing, that it's the product of this raw energy, but what Western artists, and Picasso was not alone, was admiring this primitiveness of the African objects. And so African art was labeled as primitive, which of course is a problematic term because it's seen in contrast to civilized European or Western culture, right? That Western artists, they create art out of the process of thought, but African artists are really just responding to instinct and just creating these objects. But then of course the more that you study them and you realize how they fit so intentionally and intimately into daily life and into ritual experiences, you know that they really are more than just these meaningless or mindless creations, which was kind of how they were perceived. But so this really did open the door, though, in the West to this interest in African art, and more collectors, artists were acquiring objects from Africa. And so you can walk into museums today, like, I'm not really sure actually, I found it off the internet, the wall with the red, but I know that this is a gallery in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But you walk into a museum or you walk into a gallery and you see these objects hanging on a wall or behind glass or in a vitrine. And that's not really accurate. That's not how they were meant to be seen. They were part of rituals. They were a lot of these objects that I'm going to show you today, or you see hanging here, like the wall, the red wall here, so I'm looking at opposite, on your right. Those are all masks. But the masquerade in African cultures is rarely ever just the wooden mask, and that's the object that's come down to us in the West and is displayed in museums. But it was a larger part of a spectacle. So here's an example of one of these. This is a bois, butterfly or hawk mask. The bois is a culture that's related to a number of different cultures that live in Burkina Faso, like the Bobo, the Mosi, the Nuna, and the Wanyama, and they create these fabulous plank masks. Sometimes they extend several feet up above the head, or they extend horizontally, like you see here. And so it's meant to mimic the wings of a butterfly or a hawk, but it's not doing it literally, but you get that essence of some kind of animal in flight. And so these huge wooden masks are typical of the bois, as well as the geometric shapes that you see on them. And they limit the colors to just black, white, and red. So it just looks like geometric shapes to us, and you can kind of admire it for those formal qualities, the geometry, the use of the concentric circles as they're combined with these triangular forms. But these are actually moral codes for the bois. They communicate things. And if you're a member of bois society, depending on your position in society, if you're a fully initiated member, you're going to read these symbols as something different than maybe a woman or an uninitiated member. So they are very meaningful, and they're part of something bigger, something larger. And so these photographs try to capture the massive performance. And so they're worn in front of the face, but because they're so large when they're dancing, and they spin them around very vigorously, you actually have to, the masker has to hold on to them. Or here you can see, sometimes when you watch these videos, you'll often see the mask just resting. Because they're really hard to hold these things up. They require an incredible amount of strength. You're not supposed to know who the masker is, because they're covered, their whole body is covered, because they're transformed into these spirits. But generally you can point out who a masker is in a community, because he tends to be a young male, like early 20s, with a big, thick neck, because you need that strength to hold up these masks. So, and you can see here in these photos that this is combined with drumming, there's dancing, and the whole community is involved. These masks come out during the dry season when farming doesn't happen. And so they use these masks as a way to engage in the spirits and to bring about a healthy agricultural life. Or here's another example. These are these beautifully carved masks, these helmet masks, so they're worn over the head instead of the face, of the Mende peoples. They live in Sierra Leone. And this is a tradition that's kind of coming back. Sierra Leone was engaged in terrible civil wars. But the Sande Society is a group for women. It's a way of initiating girls into womanhood. And so their masks represent ideals of womanhood, ideal beauty. And this doesn't necessarily fit the Western canon of beauty, right? So you have like these rings around the neck. That's to indicate you're a kind of plumper woman who is of good means. You have these elaborately carved coiffures. The face is very abstract and kind of limited to the bottom half of the face. But these are worn on top of the head with this full costume. These are one of the only masks that are worn by women in Africa. Most masks, even if they represent women, are danced by men. But this is an unusual circumstance. And I just want to show you a really, really brief video clip here so you can kind of get a sense of this in action. So she moves very vigorously. So it's, this really is a part of something bigger rather than just the wooden mask that would be behind a glass vitrine in a Western museum. Or another example, it's not just masks, but a variety of objects that are collected in Western museums. Like we see here, this is a Yoruba divination tray over here on the left. And so these trays are carved. There's always going to be a face on one of these divination trays. It represents the Yoruba Orisha, or a deity called Eshu. He's the messenger god. So he's the go-between between the diviner and the gods who you're trying to contact. So divination is a common practice in Yoruba culture. And so if you have some kind of problem, you might go see a diviner to resolve your problem or to find answers to solve what's happening. And so they kind of foresee into the future. And so this is an example of divination actually happening. This is the Babalawo, or the diviner, Kolowe Isatola, practicing the rite of divination. So these boards, they're covered in sand, they involve kola nuts, there are divination tappers, there's a variety of objects and actions that take place, and because they're doing serious work. So that's just to give you a brief overview of the ways in which African objects are used in a variety of contexts. And we're going to take a closer look at some individual objects that we have in the collection. And the first culture that I want to start with are the Bamana. The Bamana live, sometimes they're also referred to as the Bambara. They live in southwestern Mali. And basically their name refers to, it means pagan, because they are the groups that resisted Islam. So there are groups of indigenous farmers, although Islam really has infiltrated into Bamana culture, and a lot of the rituals and the objects that I'm going to show you connected to rituals are slowly dying. And that's another thing to think about when we think of African art, what we consider to be traditional art. Some of it is disappearing, or some of it's transforming as these communities are embracing Islam or embracing Christianity or other different kinds of religion. So the Bamana, they worship their ancestors. They make sacrifices on objects, like you see here. This is called a boli, or an altar, and it's kind of this ambiguously shaped object, sort of anthropomorphic, or excuse me, zoomorphic. So it looks like some sort of animal, but what it is hard to tell. And you can see that it's encrusted with materials, because this was not an object that just sat in a room and was meant to be looked at, but it was something that was used. So sacrifices of animals' blood, or sometimes alcohol, saliva even. These are the variety of materials that would be used to charge these objects. But the Bamana are also known for a number of masquerades. Most of these masquerades are involved in initiation. And so this is, for the Bamana, it's mainly about boys becoming men. And there's various stages of initiation. The first stage that a boy would go through is called ntomo. And these masks are worn during this stage. They're worn by uncircumcised boys. Circumcision for the Bamana, as well as for a number of other African cultures, is marked by initiation for the Bamana and other cultures is marked by circumcision. That's the physical marking of moving into manhood. And so you can identify an ntomo mask basically based on its shape. These are face masks. You wear them over your face. They're very oval. They have a long face with this long, narrow nose, a broad forehead, and a very small mouth. And so that was important. This was an important lesson to teach these boys the importance of keeping quiet, of not opening your mouth. So there's a song saying, close your mouth, close your mouth. The song, or the mouth is the enemy. And so that's, the closed mouth is indicative of that. And another characteristic that you'll often see on these masks are these horns. There's been a variety of interpretations. Sometimes we don't know how to interpret these things exactly, because this is knowledge that is only intended for those who are fully initiated into a community. And so it's not just openly shared information. So, and you'll sometimes get a variety of different stories depending on who you ask in the community. So these have been interpreted as wisdom, civilization. They're sometimes related to antelope, and so in Bamana, Bamana legend is that an antelope basically founded the Bamana community. They taught the antelope taught the Bamana agriculture, which is how their civilization was able to grow and thrive. Sometimes too, though, they're interpreted based on the number as either male or female. And you'll often see female figures on these Ntomo masks because there's this belief in the duality of genders. I mean, as boys are becoming men, that's very important that they learn about women and the importance of women in their lives. This one has some embellishments with beads, and we also have this cloth in the back. So this would have been, this is a kind of like a tie-dyed cloth. So this would have helped to conceal the masker who was wearing it. And when we're done, we can turn the lights up and can all get a better look at some of these masks. Here's some more. Sometimes they're covered in cowrie shells, so there's a variety of different types. While they maybe sort of conform to a general appearance or a general look, that there is still variety within this category of masks. And different communities are going to have their own traditions as well. So it's not a kind of static, monolithic thing. I mean, we talk about traditional African art, and sometimes we think that it's something that's always unchanging, but that certainly is not true, particularly as the Bamana have and other African cultures are now part of the global world. And so we can't expect them to not change based on these encounters. The next stage of initiation is called kore. And there's a variety of masks, different kinds of masks that appear in kore. They represent spirits. They are usually carved to represent an animal. Like this, we think represents a hyena. Now, hyenas are known for being kind of rowdy, rambunctious animals. They're not the most demure of animals. And so the hyena represents bad behavior. So the lion that you see up there, that represents more noble, regal behavior. So these are the kinds of behaviors. I mean, this is sort of still in the process of teaching boys how to become men. They're communicating good and bad behavior through masks. So the hyena will go about, they'll steal things from people's houses. This is all part of this ritual that goes on. I mean, this is all pretend, but they'll go into houses, they'll steal some things that are not very valuable, they'll be chased around by the community, but again, to reinforce what is inappropriate behavior and behavior that we should avoid. And sometimes these masks, just to point out, I don't know if you noticed, but there's a bit of a kind of buildup on the surface of this mask. It might be a little bit of paint or stain and some dirt. And sometimes sacrifices are made on the kore masks. I don't know if that was the case with this one. But you can see that there are some chips and wear and tear. And it's funny because when you're buying Western art, let's say you're going through a gallery or an auction house, condition is important, right? You're not going to spend a lot of money on something that's in bad condition. So you want something that's in good condition, hardly damaged. But in African art, when people are collecting African art, if you go to gallery websites, they'll talk about the good wear, that it's really worn. And so that's seen as something valuable because then it's considered authentic. It was actually worn. But you know, African artists they're getting pretty savvy. And so they're making these objects that they'll sell at markets look like they've been worn. So they'll maybe add some sort of paint or kind of scrape the wood down a little bit. So, you know, to sell these things, they're sort of playing the game, and they're basically responding to Western perceptions of African art. And so we started with this question of what is African art? Well, you know, now our ideas of African art are influencing the ways in which Africans create and use art. Another culture that uses masks to regulate society are the Dan. The Dan live along the border of Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast. And so there's a number of different kinds of masks that the Dan use. There's something like 11 different sorts of masks, but they fall into these two general categories, the sort of beautiful or female masks and the more aggressive male masks. So this is an example of a female mask. Now it might not have characteristics that seem overtly feminine, but it's about, these masks tend to be gentle, they are kind of kinder, funner, more entertaining masks. And so they are associated with what the Dan considered to be feminine characteristics. The Dan call their mask Glee, G-L-E, or Gi, G-E. And so generally the mask will have that at the end of the word. So here's an example of one of these female masks. They're characterized by these slits for eyes, a kind of just composed demeanor. Here's an example of a more aggressive mask, a bougli mask, and they're characterized by these eyes that protrude from the head. You can see this open mouth with teeth exposed, very violent, really. And so some of these masks are used to regulate society. This is another example of a Dan mask. This is called a Mowgli mask. So Ma means bird, this is a hornbill mask, and Glee means mask. So masks, the word Glee or Gi, it refers to the mask itself, but also the spirit that it represents. So they use those terms interchangeably because when you wear this mask, you are transformed into that spirit. There's really no difference. So for a Dan to see something like this hanging on a museum wall probably is an odd thing. These masks, it might seem kind of just, fairly innocuous, but these were actually very powerful, aggressive masks. It has those rounder, protruding eyes. And traditionally, they kind of acted like police officers in a society. They would go and round up those who were misbehaving and sometimes enact justice. So they had a very important function. Now, they're largely entertainment. So they've sort of transformed their function from something aggressive, perhaps even frightening, to something that's entertaining. And a lot of these masquerades are now, not just with the Dan, but other cultures, are primarily performed for tourists. Art is also used in some cultures to construct and legitimate power. So in most communities that use masking, they tend to be more decentralized communities, meaning that power doesn't rest in a single individual, but maybe a group of elders, or there's some kind of consensus when it comes to decision making, and the masks play a role in that process. But there are also chiefdoms and kingdoms in Africa, and they tend to use art more to construct this idea of power. So the king, or the chief, is the owner of the art generally in a community. And that is true of the Ballet in Cameroon. So in the Cameroon grasslands, there are a number of these kingdoms or chiefdoms, like the Bamlam and the Bamileke. Here's an example. This is a Bamileke chief seated here in this throne that's covered in cowrie shells. He has a leopard skin behind him. A lot of the art, or what we might call art, was associated with dress and regalia. So that was a marker of your status, and that's where a lot of artistic energies were invested. But also, we can see the chief's palace, and so they were characterized by these large staffed roofs, and then these carved pillars in the front. So it's hard to tell from this angle, but there are these elaborately carved pillars. A little bit unusual, though, for the Bamileke is the importance of masking. Because masking traditions, as I said, generally tend to be for agricultural, more decentralized communities. But there is a lot of masking that's associated with these chiefdoms in the Cameroon grasslands, and specifically the Bamileke. They're owned by the king, and they're basically help to reinforce the king's power. So one of these masks is, or I should say, a category of masks is involved with what's called the Quifo, or the Quifon Society. The word Quifo means knight. And they wear these large wooden masks. This is a little bit different than what I've been showing you. So if we look at the back, you can tell that this would be worn on your head, over your head. This is the helmet mask. So it's worn on top of your head rather than in front of your face. And it's kind of zoomorphic, but somewhat anthropomorphic too, depending on how you look at it. So the nose looks somewhat human. The eyes even look somewhat human, but then when you look at it from the side, you see this mouth, perhaps indicative of a buffalo or some sort of strong, aggressive creature. The buffalo, there are a lot of buffalo masks of the Bamileke. But basically this is an image of power, right? With this huge jaw, these exposed teeth. And for many African communities, helmet masks were aggressive masks. So there are often these categories of more gentle masks, similar to the Dan, and more aggressive masks. And helmet masks tended to be the more aggressive. Sometimes there are categories of masks that women cannot even see because they're considered to be so violent, so powerful that only the initiated males of society can view them. But these, because this is the night society, these masks come out at night. And they act as a kind of force of social control. They have a policing function. So it might not look so scary to us. This is another example of a Quifo society mask. He kind of looks like a friendly guy, but imagine him knocking on your door in the middle of the night, and whoever is wearing this mask is completely concealed in some sort of costume. It might be a little bit scary. And if you know that he's coming to your door because you've done something wrong, you've been up to no good, so there will be repercussions. I mean, in the past, they even had the power to execute criminals. So these are considered to be very, very powerful masks. Now, the cap, this is a pretty common characteristic of these masks of the Bamileke. You can kind of see it in the cap that he wears too. Anyone know what this crossing design represents? It's an animal. It doesn't quite match the animal that it represents.
Spider?
Yes, it's a spider, but only 6 legs rather than 8. But spiders are a sign of wisdom for many cultures in the Cameroon grasslands. They live underground, so this is a sign of their connection between people and the world of the ancestors. They're also used in divination, and so there's a practice of spider divination where a diviner will place palm leaf chips over a spider hole. And when the spider comes out of the hole, the chips are moved around, and then the diviner will read the configuration of the chips. And so spiders are very important animals because they are connected to the ancestors and they're seen as having this kind of wisdom. A couple more things I want to show you. Next I want to move on to the ballet. This is a culture that lives in the Ivory Coast primarily, and these are masks that have been highly collected in the West because they're really beautiful, I think. I think it's just basically based on aesthetics. And many of these masks are portraits of women. They're called blow. And these were used for entertainment, primarily. Here's an unidentified ballet woman in her portrait mask. It's a photograph that was taken in 1972. And if you really look, you can see some resemblance. For example, the artist of the mask has captured her scarification patterns on the cheeks. So sometimes they'll capture these things that identify the woman. But overall, it's not a portrait like we think of portraiture here, where the aim is to capture the likeness of the individual. But it's more emblematic. It's more about capturing the qualities of the woman for who she is rather than what she looks like. So a woman herself would never commission a mask. Somebody would have a mask commissioned for her because of her good qualities. She's seen as a sort of ideal woman, the contribution she's made to a community. So it was considered to be an honor to have this kind of mask made. Okay. Here's some more examples of these portrait masks. This is one of my favorite masks. I just think it's so lovely. It's so simple, but the balance of forms. Usually these masks have these downcast eyes, a closed mouth. These were the characteristics of the ideal woman. And we have a mask that I think might be ballet or a related culture. The ballet are closely related with the yare and the goro. So this came to the Augustana collection. It was identified as the yare, so it may actually be yare. But it was identified as a hairdresser's mask, I think because there's this big comb at the top. But a lot of masks in Africa have these horns, or what looks like a comb. So I don't think it was actually for a hairdresser. But it might be, again, indicative of this idea of wisdom and related to these concepts of beauty that ultimately this mask expressed. So it has similar qualities of the downcast eyes. The facial features are just kind of conformed to a heart here, and this closed, small mouth. It's not basically, a woman would never look somebody directly in the eye. So these masks capture that. Interestingly, for the ballet, and something very different compared to our Western ways of viewing art, is that these are not objects to be seen all the time. The more important something is for the ballet, the less it is seen. So when these masks come out, they actually come out behind these cloths. And you can catch glimpses of it, but you're never going to get a good, hard look at the mask. And it just heightens the mysteriousness of the mask. It heightens the importance, its special nature. This is pretty interesting because this is a portrait mask of a woman named Moya Yanso. And this is a photograph that was taken in 1972. The mask was sold, actually. And her Moya Yanso's grandchildren wanted another mask made, and they hired an artist who basically made a mask, I mean, just based on sort of seeing it in these performances, that looks exactly like the original. So, you know, when they do look, they're obviously, because they're not looking constantly, they are looking with meaning. Another interesting practice of the ballet are these spirit spouses, and we have one, at least what I think is a spirit spouse in our collection. Everybody has a spirit spouse. So you might have your earthly spouse, the spouse in this world, but you also have a spouse in the other world. This is something the spouse is assigned to you before you're ever even born. And then when you reach adolescence, things might start to go bad, you know, teenage angst and all that. And so it's likely the fact that your spirit spouse is starting to get jealous. Maybe you're showing interest in somebody else. And so you have a statue made of your spirit spouse. But it's not just an image of this spouse. This is the spouse. I mean, you have to take care of this. So these are washed, they are dressed, they are set up in shrines often in a bedroom usually. They are fed, they are sometimes rubbed with perfumes. A person will spend one night a week, not with their terrestrial spouse, but with their spirit spouse. So they're expected to be chaste for one night a week. And so, you know, it's about the importance of making these connections with the other world. And what we consider to be art are the means by which the ballet do it. So this is an object it's got work to do, you know, and it expects something of its users as well. So it demands a certain amount of work on the part of whoever owns it. I think this one is interesting too because she has a cross around her neck. And so you can see this melding of cultures that, you know, whoever had this probably considered himself to be Christian, yet doesn't see the problem with these traditional practices. Here's another example of a spirit spouse. And here's a shrine. A similar practice happens with the Yoruba. The Yoruba are from Nigeria. They're the most populous of ethnic groups in Africa. And they have the highest rate of twins of any culture in the world. Something like 4 times the rate of any other culture. But they also have a high infant mortality rate. So twins, you know, they're often of lower birth weight, they will often die. So when that happens, you know, there's generally grief amongst the parents. They will go to a diviner, and the diviner will direct them to a carver who will carve an Ibeji figure. So these Ibeji figures, they mean twin figures. There are thousands of these that exist still being used in shrines in Nigeria, but you can also find them in galleries and museums all throughout the world. So these represent the deceased twin. And similar to the spirit spouses, they have to be taken care of. At night they're laid down. During the day they stand up. They're dressed. Sometimes they even wear clothes that are similar to the twin that's still living, if the twin is still living. It's a lot of times this is a common practice. They'll rub an indigo dye into the coiffure. You can see this one has beads, so cowrie shells and some other beads. So, I mean, jewelry can be an aspect of it. They're fed, they're taken care of, they're set up in a shrine, often in the mother's room. So, again, it's about making that connection to the spirit world and using material means to do so. These also exhibit qualities of, that are typical of Yoruba art. Yoruba art, the head is very big. It's about 1/3 the dimensions of the entire figure. And there's a lot of emphasis on the eyes. The eyes really kind of pop out of the head. And usually there's an emphasis on the coiffure, the hairstyle. So the Yoruba think the head is a very important part of the body. They believe in this concept of the ori ade, or your outer head, and the ori inu, which is your inner head. And your outer head reflects your inner head. So the Yoruba would think nothing of spending a lot of money at the hairdresser, because it's a sign of your inner head. So there's often much emphasis on coiffures in Yoruba art. Some more examples of these Ibeji figures. And then the last type of art I want to look at are textiles. I mean, African textiles are very well known throughout the world, generally beautiful, colorful textiles. And these are things that are meant to be worn. So again, they're often now collected and hung on walls, but these were items that were meant to be worn. And one culture that's very much known for its textiles is the Kente of Ghana. And they have two primary forms of textiles. One is adinkra, which is the stamped textile, and the other is kente, which is woven. So here's an old photograph from the late 19th century of people making adinkra cloth. Basically, we're talking about cotton fabric that's then stamped with a dye. And so they use calabashes, or these gourds, they basically carve out, and they make various stamps. Pass that around. A student brought this back for me when she was in Ghana. But these are not just random pictures. They're not just cute little geometric designs, but they mean things. The Ashanti are known for using a very metaphorical language, so they rarely will speak, especially those that are associated of the community or the circle of the king. They'll rarely speak in a very direct manner, but use a very metaphorical language. And so their imagery basically is a kind of visual metaphor. So you can see some of the various signs that you would maybe find on the adinkra cloth and what they mean. So when somebody's wearing a adinkra, they're actually, sending some sort of message as they wear it. Adinkra was traditionally worn for funerals. Here's an example of a photograph of people wearing adinkra. As you can see, now this particular example of adinkra that we have incorporates some woven strips, so it's definitely transformed over time. But it's not like you would buy this fabric and then cut out a pattern into it, but it's worn around the body like a toga, as you can see here. The same thing is true of kente. Kente is probably something you've recognized because it's really had this global recognition. And I think this is a good place to sort of conclude this discussion of what is African art. Kente, as I mentioned, is woven textiles. So these are woven on looms. They're woven by men in these long strips, and this is an example of kente here. And then these long strips are woven together. Now, traditionally, kente was the prerogative of the king. Only the king and his royal court would wear kente cloth. It was woven from silk. These designs and patterns that you see mean something. They're all named. And so again, this wearing cloth, wearing textiles was not a neutral thing to do, but you were communicating certain messages. Well, in the 19th century, Ghana, this is known as the Gold Coast. It's becoming a very prosperous area, and there's a kind of emerging middle class, and they're starting to desire the things that the king and the royal court are wearing. So they want to wear kente as well. So it starts to infiltrate down to this more popular level. However, the king still had to approve any new pattern. He had first dibs of ownership, right? Before it was copyrighted, he could claim that as his own. Here's a photograph of an Ashanti Hene, or an Ashanti chief, wearing kente in a festival from 2011. And you can see he's also, in addition to the kente, he's covered in gold jewelry. He's surrounded by this whole entourage of people. There's this umbrella. All of these items basically bolster his right to rule. Nowadays, he doesn't really have any real political role. It's more ceremonial because Ghana, of course, has a president, an elected president. But Kente is now something that we see all around us. I mean, even here in America, here's just some other examples of chiefs in Kente cloth. And then I bring in this photo to conclude, because you can see some people at a graduation wearing Kente around their neck. You can see this woman, this is a fashion photo. She's wearing Kente. This is a photo I found of bridesmaids in Kente, because it's become part of our popular culture. And this was largely due to the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. He wore Kente throughout his presidency, and he promoted this idea of a pan-African identity. I don't know if you know anything about Kwame Nkrumah, but he actually was educated in the US, and he was very influenced by Marcus Garvey and this Back to Africa movement. So he brings these ideas back to Africa. And he was imprisoned for a period by the British when they were ruling Ghana, and when he was released from prison, he wore Kente cloth. As a sign of African identity. He used this as an image to really promote this idea of African independence. And so we kind of come full circle, because we start with this concept that this broad idea of Africa, when many of these objects were made, late 19th, early 20th century, didn't really exist in the minds of most of the makers of these objects. Yet, through this globalization that's occurred over the last century or so, now that idea of Africa really does exist for many Africans. And so we find African art sort of all over the world. And we also have African artists who are making art. I mean, this whole idea of what is authentic in African art is really hard to come by. If a carver is making an African mask to be sold on the market, to be sold to a tourist, and is maybe sort of duping things to make it look older, is that less authentic? Right? Should we not value the creation of this individual? Is it only authentic if it's worn in a masquerade? But what if this masquerade is really geared now towards tourists? I mean, it's hard to really come by this, what is authentic? I often ask my students, we look at contemporary African art at the end of the term, and I propose this scenario. Let's say you have an African, let's say he's Yoruba descent, grew up for most of his life in Nigeria, goes to art school in London, and spends the rest of his life in London making art that maybe is somewhat influenced by his experiences in Africa, but he does painting, two-dimensional painting. I mean, that's something that's a very Western art form. Is he an African artist? And there's a lot of debate. They don't really know how to answer that question. And there isn't a right or a wrong answer. But I think that when we really start to explore this topic and really look at the history and where we've come, we see the complexity of it. So I welcome you to come up, ask questions, take a closer look at these objects. I've also brought in some brochures. These were brochures that students of mine did a few years ago of some of the works that you see here, as well as some other objects in the collection. So they did research on these objects and wrote longer research papers, and then we took excerpts for this brochure. So, any questions I can ask? No? Yeah.
About how old would those masks and figurines be, and of what are they made?
These are primarily carved from wood. That is a common characteristic of a lot of African art, particularly West African art, and the masks as well. Although it's not the only medium, but that's the most common one. And then sometimes they'll be embellished with beads and things like that, or paints as well. Sometimes you'll find the addition of other materials. It depends on the mask and the culture, like feathers or quills or other items to give it a particular sort of meaning. Dates, good question. These are probably 20th century, maybe mid-20th century or so. A lot of what you see in museums, we're talking about works that were taken from cultures that they just didn't practice documenting things like we do. So if you ask somebody in that community, they probably knew when it was made, and they probably knew who made it, but they were just sort of taken, and that history is lost. So most of what you see in museums is about late 19th, early 20th century. That's when most of this collecting was really strong. So I always tell my students, if it's an ID quiz, when in doubt, just put late 19th, 20th century, you'll probably be okay. But we have beaded work, we have works in metals as well, so there really is a variety of media that is used throughout the continent. Yeah.
What kind of woods, and then some of them look kind of polished, what do they use to, I don't know, kind of brighten them up, or?
I mean, various materials, I think anything really that they'd have available to give them a more polished look, or sometimes, you know, they don't want them to really, these are objects that are to be used, so sometimes too, you know, they haven't sort of built up their sort of worn, you can see additional materials, so, you know, for some cultures, that newness actually isn't really a valued aspect of it. But, you know, various chisels and things like that to polish, and woodworking tools.
Yeah, I had a question. You talked about the women from the Ivory Coast and their masks. They
Yeah.
were all looking downward.
Uh-huh.
Is that the culture
Yeah.
of the women?
Yeah.
So they do not look a person?
Yeah, it wouldn't be, I mean, I'm not saying that
Right.
a woman would never look somebody in the
Right.
eye,
Right.
but in general, that is considered to be proper female behavior, is to not directly engage somebody in the eye. And, you know, it has a lot to do just with the Ballet culture as well. I mean, they just don't, the act of looking is really something that's culturally conditioned. You know, we can get access to any image we want now, we can look at anything at any time we want, and that just was not the tradition for the ballet. So yeah, it's just a different practice. Yes.
What is the effect of commercialization? Does it denigrate or enhance?
It's a good question. I mean, you know, I think there are some who would say that it would denigrate it, that these cultures are sort of losing their traditions as they're, you know, basically catering to more of a Western market. Like a lot of these performances are now primarily done for tourists, so it's not real. Like it's not really being done for religious reasons, which was the motivation for much of this when these art forms first emerged. But at the same time, I think if we always have that attitude, I think it can lead back to that concept of primitivism, that we're not allowing these cultures to advance to I mean, I hate the idea of culture being lost, but at the same time, you know, we can't sort of put these cultures in these glass boxes and expect them never to grow, never to interact. I mean, because even before European colonizers came to Africa, there's interaction between other cultures. It's not that they were these, you know, sealed, closed-off entities, but they're getting influences from one another. So, I mean, I think growth and change is just part of culture. So it's a hard question. I think it depends who you ask. I think there'd be some who would think, no, that it's not authentic, it denigrates it, but then, you know, others see this transformation as something dynamic, interesting, and just sort of another part of this history. Yeah.
The graduation picture, the stoles that they're wearing,
Mhm.
you see some students at Augustana wearing
Yeah.
stoles like is there a connection?
Well, some of it is the students who are involved in the Black Student Union, right? And some who have gone to and participated in Africa Term, I've noticed, have worn them, so, yeah.
There's a connection.
Mhm.